Have you ever noticed how some men gain authority the moment they marry, while others lose respect overnight? Two men make the same vow, stand at the same altar, but one becomes stronger and the other becomes trapped. Not because of love, not because of character, but because of what they had before they said "I do." Most people are told marriage is a moral milestone, a sign of maturity, a proof of commitment. But history shows something far colder. Marriage does not elevate a man, it magnifies him. And if you enter it poor, it magnifies weakness, dependency, and quiet desperation. People don't see a loving husband. They see a man who must provide, must comply, must endure. And when he can't, respect disappears. Slowly at first, then all at once. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this ruthless truth centuries ago. He warned that institutions meant to stabilize power will destroy men who enter them without leverage. Marriage is one of those institutions. You've watched this happen. Men who became cautious, smaller, obedient, not because they wanted to, but because poverty gave them no room to move. The same bond that crowns a powerful man can suffocate a poor one. And once you understand why, you'll realize this isn't about romance at all. It's about survival, leverage, and the cost of committing too early. Poverty is not a lack of virtue nor a stain on the soul, but it is a condition that strips a man of leverage, and leverage is the only language the world truly understands. When a man is poor, every choice he makes is observed, measured, and judged through the lens of weakness. He may speak with honesty, but it will sound like excuse. He may promise loyalty, but it will feel like dependence. He may claim love, but it will be read as need. Society pretends to admire humility, yet it punishes it relentlessly. Nowhere is this cruelty more exposed than in marriage, a contract praised as sacred while functioning as one of the most unforgiving negotiations ever devised. When a poor man enters marriage, he does not enter as an equal partner. He enters as a liability, hoping to be tolerated, and tolerance is the most fragile foundation upon which to build a life. Marriage does not soften poverty, it sharpens it. Two people do not magically become stronger when one is already constrained. Scarcity multiplies stress, and stress corrodes affection. Love spoken under abundance sounds like generosity, but love spoken under lack sounds like obligation. A poor man may believe that marriage will give him stability, that partnership will grant him strength, that shared struggle will forge loyalty. This belief is comforting, and that is precisely why it is dangerous. Comfort is the enemy of clarity. Marriage does not reward intention, it rewards capacity. It does not honor effort, it honors outcomes. When resources are thin, every failure becomes visible, every delay becomes personal, every misstep becomes evidence. Over time, respect erodes quietly, not through dramatic betrayal, but through daily disappointment that no apology can fully erase. A man without resources has no margin for error, and marriage is a structure that punishes error relentlessly. When money is scarce, time becomes scarce. When time is scarce, patience disappears. Arguments no longer revolve around character, but around survival. Bills speak louder than vows. Hunger overrides romance. Fatigue replaces tenderness. The world teaches men to believe that sacrifice earns love. But in reality, sacrifice only earns sympathy, and sympathy has an expiration date. Respect is not built on suffering together. It is built on security provided. When a man cannot provide stability, he becomes subject to scrutiny. Every purchase is questioned. Every delay is noted. Every ambition is met with anxiety instead of encouragement. This is not because people are cruel by nature, but because fear reshapes perception, and poverty breeds fear faster than any other condition. The poor man in marriage lives under constant evaluation, even when no words are spoken. Silence itself becomes judgment. His partner may still care, may still hope, may still defend him in public, but inwardly a ledger is forming. Promises are compared to results. Dreams are weighed against deadlines. Love becomes conditional without ever announcing that it has changed. This is the silent transformation that destroys men who believed that virtue alone would carry them through. A poor man may work harder than anyone he knows, yet effort without outcome is invisible. The world does not reward struggle, it rewards dominance over circumstances. Marriage does not exist outside this rule, it amplifies it. What begins as mutual support slowly shifts into expectation, then resentment, then quiet contempt masked by routine. Poverty also removes a man's ability to lead. and leadership is the unspoken backbone of attraction. A man who cannot decide freely is not free to lead. A man who must calculate every move based on cost is not commanding. He is reactive. Marriage demands decisiveness in moments of uncertainty, yet poverty forces hesitation. When choices are constrained, authority dissolves. The household begins to orbit around limitation rather than vision. Plans shrink, risks disappear. Life becomes defensive. Over time, the poor man adapts by minimizing himself to avoid conflict, believing peace is preservation. In truth, this withdrawal signals defeat. Once a man starts negotiating his presence instead of asserting direction, he has already surrendered the psychological ground that marriage requires him to hold. There is also a deeper danger, one rarely spoken aloud. Marriage binds a man legally, socially, and morally at the exact moment when he most needs flexibility. Poverty demands mobility, risk, and sometimes ruthless self-prioritization. Marriage demands stability, predictability, and sacrifice of individual ambition for shared safety. These demands are incompatible when resources are insufficient. A poor man cannot afford to be predictable. He cannot afford to be gentle with his time. He cannot afford to dilute his focus. Yet marriage expects precisely that dilution. It rewards compromise and punishes obsession. But obsession is often the only path out of poverty. By marrying too early, a poor man ties weights to his own ascent and calls it responsibility, mistaking constraint for maturity. Society will shame this truth because it threatens a comforting myth. It prefers to believe that love conquers conditions, that unity overrides economics, that commitment transforms reality. These beliefs keep people obedient and hopeful, but they do not keep them powerful. Power requires timing. Power requires sequencing. A man must first secure his position in the world before inviting another to stand beside him. To do otherwise is not noble, it is negligent. The tragedy is not that poor men marry and suffer. The tragedy is that they are taught this suffering is honorable, that endurance is virtue, and that breaking under the weight of a premature bond is personal failure rather than structural inevitability. And once a man realizes this, once he sees that marriage under poverty is not a sanctuary but a crucible designed to expose weakness, he must confront a far more dangerous question about what the world truly expects from him next. Once a man is bound while poor, he no longer moves according to strategy, but according to pressure. Every decision becomes reactive, shaped not by long vision but by immediate consequence. He wakes not asking what advances his position, but what avoids conflict today. This is how ambition is domesticated. Marriage does not destroy a man instantly. It trains him slowly to fear disruption. He learns to postpone risk, to delay decisive action, to choose certainty over assent. Poverty already limits options, but marriage hardens those limits into rules. What was once temporary becomes permanent. What was once sacrifice becomes expectation. And soon the man who needed boldness to escape his condition becomes trapped by the very structure he believed would save him. A poor man in marriage is not judged by his intent, but by his utility. His worth is measured in outcomes he cannot yet reliably produce. This creates a quiet imbalance that grows sharper with time. Dependency replaces partnership, gratitude replaces desire, and gratitude, unlike desire, does not inspire loyalty. It inspires patience, and patience wears thin. The man senses this shift but often misnames it. He believes the problem is communication, or stress, or circumstance. He does not realize the real fracture lies in power. Marriage exposes power disparities brutally. When one partner depends more, the dynamic tilts. When resources are scarce, dependence becomes visible, and when dependence is visible, respect begins to negotiate its exit. The cruel irony is that the poor man is often more morally disciplined than the wealthy one. He is cautious, restrained, conscientious. Yet these traits, admired in isolation, become liabilities under pressure. Restraint looks like hesitation. Caution looks like fear. Conscientiousness looks like weakness when the world demands results. Marriage magnifies perception. The partner sees not only the man, but the limits that surround him. She feels them in missed opportunities, in delayed milestones, in futures discussed but never reached. Over time, her faith becomes conditional on progress, and progress under constraint is slow. What begins as belief slowly transforms into doubt, and doubt corrodes intimacy faster than betrayal ever could. The man responds instinctively by giving more of himself, believing effort will restore balance. He works longer, sleeps less, sacrifices health, dignity, and identity. But effort without leverage is invisible. It does not command admiration, it merely postpones judgment. The world is indifferent to how hard a man tries. It only observes whether he wins. Marriage follows the same rule, though it pretends otherwise. When a man gives everything and still cannot change the conditions, he does not become heroic. He becomes predictable. Predictability is not security when it produces no advancement. It is stagnation, and stagnation, once perceived, cannot be unseen. Poverty also strips a man of mystery, and mystery is essential to authority. When every move is explained, every delay justified, every decision constrained by numbers, the man becomes transparent. Transparency sounds virtuous, but it invites evaluation. Evaluation invites comparison. Comparison invites dissatisfaction. A man who must constantly explain why he cannot do something slowly loses the right to decide what should be done. His world shrinks into maintenance. Dreams become hypothetical. Leadership dissolves into negotiation. And once a man is negotiating for permission rather than directing toward a future, he is no longer the axis around which the household turns. There is another danger, colder and more final. Marriage, while poor, creates witnesses to failure. Struggle alone is private. Struggle observed becomes narrative. The partner becomes the keeper of a man's lowest chapters, his repeated attempts, his unfulfilled promises. Even if she never weaponizes this knowledge, it exists, and power is always aware of who knows its weaknesses. A man who rises later must do so under the shadow of a past that was shared too early. He cannot rewrite perception easily. The image formed during scarcity lingers even when conditions change. People adjust slowly to new hierarchies, especially when they believe they understand your limits. This is why timing matters more than sentiment. Power is not opposed to love. It simply refuses to be built on hope alone. A man must first establish independence before offering union. He must arrive with surplus, not hunger, with choice, not need. Marriage entered from strength is alliance. Marriage entered from poverty is negotiation under duress. And negotiations under duress rarely favor the weaker party. As this truth settles in, another realization emerges, more unsettling than the last. Poverty does not only make marriage difficult, it trains a man to accept conditions he should have rejected long before he ever said yes. Once a man has been trained to accept unfavorable terms, he carries that training into every corner of his life. Marriage under poverty does not merely reflect weakness, it conditions obedience. The man learns to tolerate imbalance because he believes endurance is virtue. He learns to suppress instinct because instinct threatens stability. Over time, this suppression becomes character. He no longer recognizes when a boundary has been crossed because he abandoned boundaries early in exchange for peace. This is how men become manageable, not through force, but through obligation layered upon obligation until resistance feels immoral. Poverty begins the lesson. Marriage completes it. The household becomes a system of quiet surveillance. Every action is observed, every decision evaluated for risk. Not because the partner is malicious, but because scarcity demands vigilance. Fear makes everyone a watchman. The man feels this gaze constantly. He adjusts his tone, his ambition, his desires to avoid friction. Slowly he stops asking what he wants and starts asking what will be allowed. This shift is fatal to power. Authority cannot exist where permission is required. Leadership cannot grow where every step must be justified. Marriage under poverty replaces command with compliance, and compliance, once learned, is difficult to unlearn even when circumstances improve. A poor man also loses the luxury of silence. Silence is power when it conceals intention, but poverty forces explanation. He must explain delays, justify risks, defend plans that have not yet paid off. Explanation diminishes stature. The more a man explains, the more he invites judgment. Judgment invites doubt. Doubt invites control. Marriage accelerates this cycle. What could have been a period of quiet construction becomes a constant defense. His mind shifts from creation to reassurance, from strategy to appeasement, and a man who appeases cannot intimidate fate into yielding to him. There is a psychological toll that rarely receives attention. When a man binds himself while poor, he internalizes failure as identity rather than circumstance. Each missed target feels personal. Each compromise feels permanent. He begins to see himself through the eyes of someone waiting for him to become more than he is. This waiting is heavy. It reshapes posture, speech, and self-concept. Confidence becomes performative rather than grounded. Hope becomes fragile. The man no longer believes expansion is inevitable. He treats it as conditional, and conditional belief produces conditional action, hesitant and fragmented. Marriage also anchors a man to routine at the exact stage where disruption is necessary. Poverty is escaped through asymmetry, through moves that appear irrational to the cautious mind. Long hours, unstable income, social risk, obsession that borders on madness. These are intolerable within a marriage that depends on predictability for emotional survival. The partner may say she understands, may offer words of support, but her nervous system seeks stability. Her fear speaks louder than her faith, and fear always votes against risk. Thus the man trims his ambition to preserve harmony, unaware that harmony purchased at the cost of trajectory is simply decay slowed to a polite pace. Another consequence emerges quietly. Resentment turns inward. The man cannot openly resent the structure because he chose it. He cannot resent his partner because she is also constrained. So he resents himself. Self-directed resentment is corrosive. It manifests as fatigue, irritability, apathy. He loses sharpness. He loses edge. The hunger that once drove him dulls into routine effort. He tells himself this is maturity. In truth, it is domestication. The wildness required to escape limitation has been traded for responsibility that produces no leverage. History shows repeatedly that men who rise from nothing do so through periods of ruthless focus, unshared hardship, and singular obsession. They are not cruel because they lack love, but because timing demands isolation. The world does not reward divided attention. It rewards total commitment. Marriage under poverty fractures commitment by design. It asks a man to give emotionally what he cannot yet give materially, and the imbalance poisons both. By the time resources appear, the man is already shaped by years of compromise, and the ascent, if it comes at all, arrives slower, heavier, burdened by expectations forged in scarcity. And once a man recognizes that his greatest obstacle was never lack of effort but premature obligation, he must face an even harsher realization about how easily loyalty is demanded before power is earned. Loyalty demanded before power is earned is not loyalty at all, but leverage disguised as devotion. A poor man who marries is asked to prove reliability without being granted authority. He is expected to uphold promises while lacking the means to enforce them. This inversion quietly humiliates him, even if no insult is spoken. Humiliation does not always arrive as ridicule. Often it arrives as expectation without capacity. The man feels it when he must reassure instead of decide, when he must negotiate instead of direct. Over time, he adapts by shrinking his will to fit the space allowed. He tells himself this is sacrifice. In reality, it is erosion. Marriage under poverty also distorts the perception of time. Urgency disappears because urgency creates instability. The man learns to slow down his ambitions to maintain peace. He begins to delay decisive moves, convincing himself there will be a better moment later. Later becomes a refuge for unfinished courage. Poverty already steals time through necessity. Marriage compounds the theft by demanding emotional availability that produces no material return. The days fill with maintenance rather than momentum. Years pass quietly. Progress, if it occurs, feels accidental rather than commanded. And what is not commanded cannot be respected. The structure of marriage also creates witnesses to hesitation. Every failed attempt, every retreat from risk, is observed and remembered. Even when forgiveness is granted, memory remains. People do not forget patterns. They tolerate them until they no longer can. A man who repeatedly delays advancement trains those around him to expect delay. Expectation shapes treatment. Treatment shapes self-image. The poor man becomes the man who is always almost there. Almost is the most dangerous word in existence. It keeps hope alive while draining urgency. It allows decline to masquerade as patience. Another transformation occurs that few men anticipate. Desire shifts into obligation. What was once freely given becomes required. Affection becomes scheduled. Intimacy becomes conditional on mood, shaped by stress. The man senses that love is now intertwined with performance, yet performance under scarcity is erratic. This creates anxiety that never fully sleeps. Anxiety destroys presence. A man who cannot be present cannot command attention. He may still be physically there, but his mind is elsewhere, calculating survival. Over time, attraction weakens, not because love vanished, but because tension replaced polarity. The poor man becomes safe, predictable, and exhausted. None of these traits inspire reverence. Poverty also limits generosity, and generosity is a powerful tool of authority. A man who cannot give freely feels indebted even when no debt is claimed. He hesitates to assert himself because he feels he has not earned the right. This internal accounting is devastating. Power requires the assumption of worth, not its proof. The wealthy man gives and is thanked. The poor man receives and feels watched. Marriage amplifies this imbalance. Every sacrifice offered by the partner, real or imagined, becomes a silent reminder of deficiency. Even kindness, when repeated under strain, becomes a ledger, and ledgers always produce reckoning. The most dangerous illusion is the belief that shared struggle creates unbreakable bonds. Shared struggle creates shared memory, not shared power. When the struggle ends, the memory remains, shaping how each person is seen. A man who was weak once is rarely seen as fully strong later by those who watched him struggle. First impressions formed under scarcity harden into identity. Marriage ensures those impressions are intimate and enduring. The man may change, but perception lags behind reality. He must work twice as hard to be seen as half as formidable. This is not cruelty, it is human nature observing consistency. The final trap is moral. The poor man is praised for choosing responsibility, for honoring commitment, for valuing family over ambition. Society applauds him because his choice reassures others that restraint is noble. Yet the same society quietly ignores his stagnation. Praise replaces reward. Approval replaces advancement. He becomes a symbol rather than a force. Symbols are celebrated. Forces are feared. History remembers forces. As this realization sharpens, the man must confront a truth more bitter than poverty itself, that restraint praised too early becomes a cage disguised as virtue, and escaping it requires a ruthlessness he was taught to abandon long ago. To escape a cage disguised as virtue, a man must first admit that virtue has been used against him. This admission is painful because it feels like betrayal of everything he was taught to respect. Yet power has never cared about comfort. It only responds to clarity. Marriage under poverty weaponizes morality by turning patience into obligation and loyalty into restraint. The man is praised for enduring conditions that slowly drain his capacity to change them. Each compliment becomes a sedative. Each encouragement to persevere becomes a reminder to stay in place. The system does not need to punish him. It simply needs him to believe suffering is proof of character. Once he accepts that belief, he polices himself. The poor married man also becomes vulnerable to manipulation through guilt. Guilt is the most effective leash because it convinces the restrained that resistance is selfish. He is told that prioritizing ambition is abandonment, that risk is irresponsibility, that focus is neglect. These accusations do not need to be spoken aloud to work. He internalizes them and begins to censor his own instincts. Even moments of clarity are quickly suppressed by imagined consequences. He asks himself who will be disappointed, who will feel unsafe, who will suffer if he chooses himself. Power evaporates in this calculation. A man who must ask permission from ghosts cannot move decisively in the real world. As years pass, another shift occurs. The man's environment adapts to his limitation. Friends stop expecting boldness. Opportunities are no longer offered because hesitation is assumed. The world mirrors what it senses. Poverty is not only financial, it is reputational. Marriage fixes that reputation early. It tells the world this man has settled into stability, that he has chosen maintenance over conquest. Even if he dreams otherwise, perception hardens around him. Networks close quietly. Doors do not slam, they simply stop opening. The man mistakes this silence for peace, unaware that momentum has abandoned him. There is also the matter of inheritance of weakness. Children, when present, absorb not only values but atmosphere. They learn caution from fear, restraint from scarcity, compromise from observation. The man tells himself he is building something noble, yet he is transmitting limits. Poverty combined with obligation teaches survival, not dominance. Survival is not legacy. Legacy requires surplus, vision, and the willingness to prioritize future over present comfort. Marriage under poverty binds the man to the present so tightly that the future becomes abstract. He speaks of it often, but his actions orbit immediate needs. Over time, words lose credibility, even to himself. Some men respond by hardening emotionally. They withdraw, becoming cold, efficient, distant. They believe this restores authority. In truth, it only deepens isolation. Authority without resources is theater. It convinces no one for long. Others attempt rebellion. Brief bursts of risk followed by retreat when consequences arrive. These oscillations exhaust everyone involved and reinforce the original judgment that the man is unstable, unreliable, not yet ready. Each failed surge teaches him to be smaller next time. The cage tightens without a single bar being moved. The cruelest aspect is that escape becomes more difficult the longer one waits. Obligations compound, expectations solidify, the cost of disruption increases. What could have been a sharp, temporary rupture becomes an unimaginable upheaval. The man delays again, believing patience will one day be rewarded. But time does not reward patience, it rewards positioning. While he waits, others advance. They acquire leverage, visibility, options. By the time the poor married man feels the urgency clearly, he is surrounded by reasons to stay still. The system has done its work. This is why the decision must be made before attachment, not after disillusionment. Power is merciless about sequence. First position, then partnership. First surplus, then sharing. First independence, then union. To reverse the order is to invite struggle that feels noble but produces nothing of lasting force. A man who understands this does not despise marriage. He respects it enough to refuse it prematurely. He knows that entering from weakness poisons what could have been alliance. And as this understanding settles fully, another, more dangerous thought rises to the surface, that many structures praised as moral are merely mechanisms designed to stabilize men before they become difficult to control. And recognizing this is only the beginning of a far harsher education. That harsher education begins when a man realizes control rarely arrives as command. It arrives as consent shaped by fear. Structures do not restrain men by force alone, but by timing obligations before leverage exists. Marriage under poverty is one of the most effective of these structures because it binds a man emotionally while he is still economically fragile. It converts hope into responsibility and ambition into risk. Once bound, the man becomes predictable, and predictability is the enemy of power. Systems prefer men who can be forecasted, managed, and soothed. A man who must account for others before securing himself is already half neutralized. He may still dream of ascent, but his movements are slowed, his angles limited, his willingness to disrupt dulled. The poor married man is taught to confuse stability with strength. Stability feels virtuous because it calms anxiety, yet strength is disruptive by nature. Strength rearranges hierarchies, it breaks routines, it alarms those who depend on sameness. Marriage under scarcity trains a man to value calm over momentum. He learns to fear upheaval because upheaval threatens the fragile balance holding everything together. This fear becomes internalized. Even when opportunities arise that require chaos to unlock growth, he hesitates. He asks whether the household can survive the turbulence. He chooses preservation over expansion. In doing so, he trades the possibility of future dominance for the certainty of present order. Another consequence appears in how the man relates to authority beyond the home. A man accustomed to negotiating for peace at home becomes adept at submission elsewhere. He avoids confrontation with employers, institutions, and rivals because conflict has been framed as danger rather than opportunity. Poverty taught him caution. Marriage codified it. He learns to accept unfavorable terms, telling himself compromise is wisdom. But power is not accumulated through compromise with those who already hold leverage. It is accumulated through refusal, through walking away, through tolerating short-term instability for long-term advantage. The poor married man rarely walks away. He cannot afford to. And what a man cannot afford to do controls him. The man may still speak of principles, of honor, of responsibility, and these words may even be sincere, yet sincerity does not intimidate reality. Reality responds only to pressure. A man without surplus cannot apply pressure. Marriage drains surplus before it exists. Emotional labor, financial obligation, social expectation, and moral restraint all draw from the same limited reserve. The man gives until nothing remains, then wonders why the world does not bend to him. He has mistaken depletion for virtue. Virtue without leverage is decoration. It impresses no one who matters. As years accumulate, the man's self-concept hardens around limitation. He stops imagining radical change because imagination without permission feels dangerous. He learns to adjust expectations downward to avoid disappointment. This adjustment feels like maturity, but it is adaptation to constraint. The mind reshapes itself to fit the cage. Once that happens, escape requires not effort, but violence against identity. The man must be willing to betray the version of himself that learned to survive quietly. Few men are prepared for this. It feels like abandoning loved ones, values, and history all at once, so most do not attempt it. They call endurance, wisdom, and stagnation peace. It is important to understand that this outcome is not the result of malice. No one conspires in a room to trap poor men through marriage. The mechanism works precisely because it feels natural. Love, duty, and responsibility are powerful incentives. They are also efficient restraints when introduced too early. Systems prefer early binding because it stabilizes populations. A man who must feed a family does not revolt easily. A man who fears disruption does not challenge order. Marriage under poverty serves society well. It keeps men focused on maintenance instead of transformation. It produces workers, not disruptors, caretakers, not conquerors. The lesson, then, is not hatred of union, nor contempt for commitment. It is respect for sequence. Power respects order. First establish independence, then invite attachment. First become difficult to replace, then become generous. First command your own fate, then intertwine it with another's. To reverse this order is to gamble with loaded dice. A man who understands this does not rush into bonds to prove virtue. He delays to build capacity. He accepts temporary loneliness to avoid permanent limitation. And as this truth settles deeper, it forces him to confront an even more unsettling possibility, that many of the choices praised as selfless are only praised because they prevent men from becoming dangerous before the world is ready to deal with them. When a man begins to sense that the world fears him becoming dangerous, he is tempted to dismiss the thought as arrogance. He has been trained to distrust his own potential, yet power has always been cautious about who is allowed to rise unencumbered. Men without attachments move unpredictably. They can take risks others cannot. They can disappear, reappear, rebuild, and burn bridges without collapsing a household behind them. This freedom is unsettling to systems that rely on continuity. Marriage under poverty removes this threat early. It anchors the man to place, routine, and obligation before he has proven what he could become. In doing so, it neutralizes possibility without ever appearing hostile to it. The man who accepts early binding is often told he is mature, responsible, grounded. These words are rewards for compliance, not indicators of strength. They soothe the ego while narrowing the future. The man is praised for staying, for enduring, for being reasonable. Reasonable men are easy to manage. They do not shock the hierarchy. They do not disrupt established arrangements. They ask for permission where others take initiative. Over time, the reasonable man forgets how to be unreasonable, and unreasonableness is often the first step toward dominance. Every major shift in history was initiated by someone unwilling to accept the terms offered to him at the time. Poverty married to obligation also creates fear of loss that outweighs desire for gain. Loss becomes vivid because it is immediate and shared. Gain feels abstract because it is delayed and uncertain. The man calculates downside relentlessly while upside fades into theory. This imbalance paralyzes him. He becomes conservative not by ideology but by exhaustion. When energy is constantly spent maintaining stability, there is little left for expansion. The man does not fail dramatically, he plateaus quietly. Quiet plateaus are dangerous because they feel safe. Years can pass before he realizes nothing has changed except his tolerance for disappointment. Another subtle effect emerges in how the man relates to truth. He begins to soften his words, to avoid stating harsh realities because they threaten harmony. He learns to edit himself. This self-censorship spills outward. He avoids confrontation with injustice, inefficiency, and disrespect because he has learned that peace must be preserved at all costs. Yet peace purchased through silence accumulates debt. Unspoken truths rot. Authority requires the willingness to speak what destabilizes. A man who has trained himself to prioritize comfort over clarity loses this edge. His presence becomes agreeable rather than formidable. Agreeable men are liked. They are rarely followed. The man may still fantasize about a future where everything aligns, where money improves and power arrives without disruption. This fantasy keeps him compliant. He tells himself timing will solve what courage has avoided. But timing does not correct missequenced choices. It only hardens them. The longer a structure stands, the more force is required to dismantle it. What once required decisiveness now requires upheaval. The man senses this and delays further, mistaking avoidance for patience. This loop continues until desire dulls and the question of escape feels irrelevant. At that point, the cage no longer needs a lock. The man guards it himself. It must be said plainly, not all men are meant to rise quickly, and not all should avoid union. But a man who is poor and ambitious faces a specific danger. His hunger makes him susceptible to promises of stability that feel like progress, but are merely postponement. Marriage offers meaning when identity is uncertain. It offers structure when direction is unclear. These offerings are seductive because they relieve anxiety. But relief is not advancement. Advancement requires tension, discomfort, and often isolation. A man cannot pursue ascent with full force while carrying the emotional weight of others who depend on his consistency for their own sense of safety. The world praises sacrifice because sacrifice stabilizes systems. It calls restraint wisdom because restraint prevents upheaval. It frames early obligation as virtue because it limits volatility. A man who understands power recognizes these incentives for what they are. He does not rage against them, he simply steps outside their timing. He delays binding not out of selfishness, but out of precision. He knows that entering union from weakness poisons both partners, while entering from strength elevates both. And as this precision sharpens, he approaches a final, uncomfortable insight, that power does not ask permission to exist, and any structure that requires a man to prove his goodness before earning his freedom is not preparing him for greatness, but protecting the world from the consequences of his unchecked ascent. Once a man accepts that freedom is something earned, not granted, he begins to see how early bonds function as tests he was never meant to pass. They are not trials of strength but of submission. Marriage under poverty tests whether a man will choose comfort over potential, whether he will trade future dominance for present approval. Most pass this test easily, and that is why it is administered so often. The reward is stability, the cost is trajectory. Power does not punish men for refusing this bargain. It simply waits for those who do. Those who refuse appear reckless, selfish, even dangerous. Those labels are warnings, not criticisms. They signal deviation from the expected path. A man who delays union while poor is often misunderstood. His restraint is framed as fear of commitment rather than respect for sequence. His solitude is treated as deficiency rather than strategy. Yet solitude grants clarity. It allows obsession without apology. It permits long hours, erratic income, relocation, and failure without collateral damage. These conditions are intolerable within marriage, but essential for escape from limitation. The world pretends these sacrifices can be shared. In truth, they cannot. Someone always pays the emotional cost, and when that cost is imposed rather than chosen, resentment grows. A man who rises must be ruthless about who bears the weight of his ascent. Bearing it alone is the cleanest option. There is also the matter of perception during ascent. A man who builds himself without witnesses controls his narrative. He reveals strength only once it is undeniable. Marriage during poverty exposes every weakness in real time. The man is seen struggling, doubting, recalibrating. When he later succeeds, observers remember the struggle more vividly than the victory. Respect is diluted by familiarity with weakness. Power thrives on selective revelation. It prefers distance. It prefers mystery. A man who reveals too much too early forfeits this advantage permanently. Those closest to him become anchored to an outdated image, and no amount of progress fully updates their perception. As wealth and leverage increase, dynamics do not reset cleanly. They carry momentum from the past. Patterns formed under scarcity linger. Roles established early resist revision. A man who was once questioned must now assert himself against habits already ingrained. This assertion is interpreted as change of character rather than emergence of truth. The partner may feel displaced by the shift, threatened by authority that arrives late. What should be celebration becomes tension. What should be alliance becomes renegotiation. The man wonders why success feels heavier than struggle. He does not realize he is fighting gravity created years earlier. The deeper lesson is not that marriage is hostile to power, but that power is unforgiving about order. Sequence determines outcome. To invert sequence is to create friction that never fully disappears. A man who marries from strength enters as chooser. A man who marries from poverty enters as applicant. Applicants are evaluated. Choosers are accommodated. This difference echoes through every interaction. It shapes tone, expectation, forgiveness, and authority. Once set, it is difficult to reverse without conflict. And conflict within marriage is costly, because it threatens the stability that justified the bond in the first place. Some men attempt to compensate by accumulating material success later, believing money alone will correct imbalance. It rarely does. Money changes circumstances, not memory. It alters options, not identity. Authority is not purchased. It is assumed when conditions allow it to be assumed without resistance. Marriage under poverty teaches resistance. It trains those around the man to question his decisions, to expect explanation, to anticipate delay. When he later moves decisively, the environment resists because it has learned a different rhythm. Power demands alignment. Alignment cannot be forced on those conditioned to another pace. Understanding this does not require bitterness. It requires realism. A man must ask not whether he deserves companionship, but when companionship strengthens rather than weakens his position. Desire is not a guide. Fear is not a guide. Only leverage clarifies timing. When a man has surplus, he can absorb compromise without losing momentum. When he has options, he can give without feeling indebted. When he has independence, he can bind himself without being bound. Marriage entered under these conditions becomes strategy rather than shelter. This is why restraint early is not denial of love, but preparation for it. A man who waits does not reject union, he preserves its value. He refuses to dilute partnership into mutual survival. He insists that when he offers himself, he does so from abundance, not hunger, from choice, not need. And as this understanding crystallizes, it leads him toward a final reckoning, one that challenges the most comforting belief of all, that good intentions protect men from bad outcomes, when in truth only power determines which intentions are allowed to succeed. When a man finally accepts that intentions are irrelevant without force, he stops asking whether his choices are kind, and starts asking whether they are effective. This shift unsettles him because it contradicts everything he was praised for earlier in life. He was rewarded for being agreeable, dependable, and self-sacrificing. Yet none of these traits altered his position. They only made him predictable. Power does not emerge from predictability. It emerges from disruption controlled by strategy. Marriage under poverty rewards predictability at the exact moment a man needs volatility. It teaches him to smooth edges instead of sharpening them, and edges are what cut paths through resistance. A man who remains unattached while poor retains the ability to recalibrate instantly. If an opportunity fails, he pivots without collateral damage. If a city becomes hostile, he leaves. If a risk demands total commitment, he gives it without apology. These freedoms are not luxuries, they are tools. Marriage removes them by design. It replaces optionality with obligation. Obligation narrows maneuvering space. Narrow space forces caution. Caution slows ascent. By the time the man recognizes the pattern, he has already internalized restraint as identity. He calls it responsibility because responsibility sounds noble. In reality, it is simply constraint accepted early. The danger intensifies when the man begins to believe that suffering itself will be rewarded. He waits for recognition that never arrives. He expects endurance to convert into authority. But power does not reward patience, it exploits it. Systems rely on patient men to keep moving quietly beneath louder, bolder actors. The patient man becomes infrastructure. Infrastructure is essential but invisible. No one praises the foundation of a building unless it cracks. Marriage under poverty accelerates this transformation. The man becomes reliable support rather than visible force. He is needed but not elevated, used but not followed. There is also the erosion of self-trust. Each postponed risk teaches the man that instinct is dangerous. Each compromise teaches him that desire must be filtered. Over time, he no longer recognizes his own appetite for dominance. He confuses peace with fulfillment. This confusion is lethal to ambition. A man who cannot feel hunger cannot pursue conquest. Marriage under scarcity feeds just enough comfort to dull hunger, while maintaining just enough pressure to exhaust effort. It is a perfect equilibrium for stagnation. The world reinforces this trap with narratives of virtue. It praises the man for choosing family over ambition, for being grounded, for knowing his place. These compliments are subtle commands. They suggest that wanting more is immature, that dissatisfaction is ingratitude. The man absorbs these judgments and begins to police himself. He stops dreaming aloud. He avoids language that suggests disruption. His vision shrinks to maintenance and minor improvement. He becomes careful with words, careful with time, careful with hope. Carefulness becomes character, and character, once formed, resists transformation. Some men reach a breaking point. They feel a surge of clarity, a violent awareness that their life is narrowing. In that moment, they face a brutal choice. Either they accept the narrowing and redefine it as contentment, or they attempt escape at great cost. Escape is not romantic. It demands conflict, disappointment, and accusations of betrayal. It requires the man to shatter an identity that others depend on for their own sense of safety. Most men retreat from this threshold. They choose peace. Peace, however, is not neutral. It sides with the status quo. It preserves hierarchy. It ensures the man remains exactly where he is. Those who do escape pay a price that is often misinterpreted. They are labeled selfish, unstable, reckless. These labels function as warnings to others. They discourage imitation. The world punishes deviation to maintain order, but punishment does not mean error. It means threat. A man willing to disrupt expectation exposes how fragile those expectations were. That exposure is intolerable to systems built on compliance. Marriage under poverty is one of the earliest tools used to prevent such disruption by anchoring men before they learn how much force they could generate. Understanding this does not absolve the man of responsibility. It intensifies it. He must now accept that his stagnation was not accidental. It was engineered through incentives he willingly accepted. This realization is heavy because it removes excuses. It leaves only choice. Either he continues to live as a stabilizing element for others, or he reclaims volatility and accepts the consequences. There is no third path. And as this truth settles fully, the final question emerges, sharper than any before, whether a man values being praised for his restraint more than he values becoming someone the world must reckon with once restraint is no longer an option. When a man reaches the end of this reasoning, he stands alone with a decision that cannot be softened by language. He must choose whether his life will be organized around acceptance or around force. Acceptance offers immediate relief. Force offers delayed consequence. The world urges acceptance because acceptance preserves existing arrangements. Force unsettles them. A man who married under poverty already made this choice once, even if he did not know it at the time. He chose acceptance early, believing it would mature into power. Now he must decide whether to repeat that choice indefinitely or correct it while correction is still possible. Correction is not gentle. It does not announce itself as growth. It arrives as rupture. The man who reclaims power must violate expectations he helped build. He must move in ways that feel disloyal to those who benefited from his restraint. This is why many men retreat at the final step. They confuse discomfort in others with moral error in themselves. They forget that morality without leverage is merely compliance with the loudest expectation. Power does not ask whether it will offend. It asks whether it will succeed. A man who waits for universal approval will never move decisively enough to alter his position. The final illusion to discard is the belief that suffering has meaning on its own. Suffering only has meaning when it produces leverage. Otherwise, it is merely endurance mistaken for virtue. Marriage under poverty sanctifies endurance. It teaches men to wear limitation as proof of character. But character without command is irrelevant. History does not measure goodness by patience. It measures impact by outcomes. The world is not cruel for this. It is consistent. A man who accepts this consistency stops pleading with reality and starts positioning against it. This is where timing reveals its true weight. The man who delays union until he has force enters marriage as a stabilizer rather than a stabilized object. He brings options instead of demands. He chooses rather than negotiates. He can afford generosity because generosity no longer threatens his ascent. Love offered from strength is not anxious. It does not monitor, ration, or resent. It gives freely because it is not keeping score. Marriage entered this way becomes amplification, not restraint. It multiplies power instead of containing it. By contrast, the man who binds himself early carries scarcity into every interaction, even after money appears. Scarcity is not erased by income, it is erased by position. Position comes from independence earned before attachment. Without that sequence, wealth feels temporary, authority feels contested, and success feels fragile. The man may never articulate this, but he feels it. He senses that his power rests on unstable ground. He compensates with caution or control. Neither restores what was lost at the beginning. There is no condemnation here, only clarity. Some men will choose stability and call it peace. Others will choose force and accept the price. The tragedy lies not in either choice, but in making one without understanding its permanence. Marriage under poverty is not a mistake because it is immoral. It is a mistake because it fixes a man's position before he has earned the right to choose how he will be fixed. It finalizes identity too early. Power is patient, but it is not forgiving about sequence. A man who understands this truth does not argue with those who disagree. He moves quietly. He arranges his life so that when he commits from surplus. He does not announce his strategy because strategy revealed becomes permission denied. He lets others praise restraint while he builds capacity. He accepts temporary misunderstanding to avoid permanent limitation. When he finally binds himself, it is because binding no longer limits his movement. It formalizes it. And this is the last thing to remember. Marriage is not the enemy of power. Premature binding is. Poverty is not shameful. Obligation under poverty is. A man must first become someone the world cannot easily constrain. Only then should he invite another to share his path. Anything else is not sacrifice. It is surrender performed too early. Power respects those who wait until they can afford to give, and it ignores those who give before they can afford to refuse. If you've made it this far, it's because a part of you already knows this truth. Poverty turns love into leverage and marriage into a cage. When a man lacks power, every promise becomes a liability, every vow a weakness waiting to be exploited. Commitment without resources is not loyalty, it's exposure. Now tell me in the comments, are you ready to build power before binding yourself to anyone? Are you willing to delay comfort today to avoid lifelong submission tomorrow? If this message touched you, if it made sense, write in the comments, I choose power first. Let's see how many here are truly willing to think long-term instead of emotionally. And don't forget, keep watching the next video. It's important, much more than you imagine. See you there.